A mail-order bride arrives in the unforgiving Arizona territory to find her intended dead, leaving her with 7 hardened orphans and his estranged, enigmatic brother. Bound by a dead man's wish, she must battle not only the harsh frontier but a fierce, untamed love that ignites in the heart of desolation. The promise had been whispered in ink on brittle paper, a homestead under an endless Arizona sky, a good man named Richard Walker, and a life carved from grit and sunlight. But when Abigail Cole stepped from the steam-hissing train onto the sun-baked platform of Redemption Gulch, the sky was a brassy, unforgiving bowl of heat. There was no Richard, no welcome party, only dust, a shimmering haze, and a boy with eyes far too old for his face, standing barefoot in the dirt. He clutched a splintered plank of wood. "You the woman?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. Abigail's throat was parchment. "I'm Abigail Cole. I've come for Mr. Walker." The boy's gaze didn't waver. "He's dead. Snakebite. 2 days gone." The words were stones dropped in a silent well. Behind the boy, a lone rider on a dark horse washed from the shade of the livery, his hat pulled low. He was still as a predator, a man who belonged to the heat and the silence. He was the only other soul in sight, and his stillness felt like a judgment. Part 1. A Ghost and a Guardian. "I'm Jedediah," the boy stated, not as an introduction, but as a fact of the landscape, like a cactus or a rock. "We buried him ourselves." Abigail's grip tightened on the handle of her worn trunk, the leather sweating against her palm. There must be a mistake. His letter. "It came just last month." "He wrote it after," Jedediah said, his gaze flicking for a split second towards the silent rider, who had not moved. "Wrote it while the poison was working on him. Figured you might come anyway." The world tilted, the horizon wobbling in the oppressive heat. She had spent her last dollar on this passage, fleeing a life of quiet servitude in Boston for the promise of being a wife, a partner. Instead, she was a postscript to a tragedy. "How many?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. "7 of us," Jedediah said. "Or 6 now. Baby sister went with Ma last winter." He hooked a thumb over his shoulder, a gesture of weary finality. "We ain't got nobody else." The train whistle shrieked a final mournful farewell, its steam dissolving into the vast, indifferent sky. It was leaving her here. The rider finally urged his horse forward, the slow clop of hooves on dirt the only sound. He stopped a respectful distance away, dismounting in a single fluid motion. He was tall, lean, and weathered, with a holster tied low on his hip. He took off his hat, revealing dark, sweat-dampened hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. They were piercing, assessing her from head to toe. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Name's Silas Walker. Richard was my brother." Abigail stared. Another Walker. A brother Richard had never mentioned in his careful, hopeful letters. "He never spoke of you." A muscle twitched in Silas' jaw. "We didn't part on speaking terms, but blood is blood, and his last letter found its way to me. Mentioned he was sending for a woman." His gaze was unnervingly direct, a stark contrast to the hollowed-out look in the boy's eyes. Looks like his hope outran his luck. This was too much. A dead fiancé, 6 orphans, and now a ghost of a brother-in-law. A man who looked as untamed as the land itself. The wildness she'd imagined was supposed to be in the landscape, not in the eyes of the man standing before her. There was a raw, dangerous energy about him that was both terrifying and magnetic. "What do you want?" Abigail asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Nothing from you," Silas replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I came to see to my brother's affairs. To see to them." He nodded towards Jedediah. "The land, the children, they're my responsibility now." "No, they ain't," Jedediah snapped, stepping in front of Abigail, brandishing his plank of wood like a rifle. "Pa said to wait for her. He said she was coming to be our ma." A profound, aching silence fell between the 3 of them. Abigail looked from the fierce, defiant boy to the hard, unreadable man. She was a stray cat caught between two feral dogs, fighting over a territory she had no claim to. Yet, the boy's words, "our ma," struck a chord deep inside her. It was the one thing she had longed to be. "Where is the house?" she asked Jedediah, her voice quiet but firm. Jedediah pointed past the ridge. Silas watched her, his expression a mask. "It's a hard life out here, ma'am. Nothing like Boston. This ain't your fight." Abigail met his gaze, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "You know nothing about my fights, Mr. Walker." She bent down and picked up her smaller satchel. "I believe a man's last wish is a sacred thing." She looked at Jedediah. "Lead the way." The boy gave Silas a triumphant glare before turning to heave one of her heavy trunks onto his bony shoulder. As Abigail followed the small, determined figure, she could feel Silas' eyes burning into her back. She had come seeking a marriage of convenience. She had found a ghost, a pack of orphans, and a man who felt like a storm on the horizon. And in the deepest part of her soul, a place she thought had long turned to dust, something wild and reckless whispered back to the silent man watching her go. "This is my fight now." Part 2. The First Stitch. The homestead was less a house and more a scar on the landscape. A one-room cabin of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud that was crumbling back to dust. A crooked porch sagged under the weight of an unseen grief. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, poverty, and the faint, sour scent of sickness. 6 pairs of eyes, wide and silent in the gloom, tracked her every move. They were huddled together at a rough-hewn table, a tableau of silent waiting. Jedediah dropped the trunk with a floor-shaking thud. "This was Pa's chair," he said, indicating the empty seat at the head of the table. "Then it will remain his," Abigail said, her voice gentle. She set down her satchel and surveyed the scene. Her heart, which had been a tight, painful knot, began to ache with a different kind of pain. A fierce, protective pity. A girl with dirt-smudged cheeks and haunted eyes stood slowly, clutching a wooden spoon. "I'm Martha," she whispered. "I do the stirrin'. Ma did, for she bled out with the baby." Abigail looked into the pot on the cold hearth. A thin, watery broth held 2 lonely beans and a few slivers of potato. This wasn't a meal. It was a memory of one. Without a word, she unbuttoned her sleeves and rolled them up. "Let's begin again," she said. From her travel bag, she produced a small cloth-wrapped parcel, salted pork, a wedge of hard cheese, and a handful of dried herbs. To the children. It was a king's ransom. The silence in the room shifted, charged with a new energy, anticipation. Even the baby, nestled in a wooden crate, stirred and whimpered. She worked with an efficiency born of necessity, adding her meager supplies to the pot, crushing the herbs between her fingers until their fragrance cut through the stale air. The smell of cooking meat filled the small cabin, a scent of life and plenty that felt almost holy. She ladled the thickened stew into chipped bowls, handing them out one by one. "Eat slowly," she commanded softly. "Let your bodies remember." They ate with a desperate, silent reverence. Martha's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Abigail didn't eat. She leaned against the doorframe, her own stomach twisting with hunger, but her heart was filling with something else. This wasn't just a meal. It was an anchor. It was a claim. As dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, Silas Walker rode up to the cabin. He didn't dismount immediately, but sat on his horse, watching the thin curl of smoke rise from the chimney. It was a different smoke from this morning. It smelled of hearth and home, not of a lonely campfire. He had spent the day tracking, checking the property lines, his mind a whirlwind of anger at his dead brother and a reluctant sense of duty. He had expected to find a flighty eastern bird, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. He hadn't expected this. He swung down from his horse as Abigail stepped onto the porch. The children were inside, the low murmur of their voices a sound he hadn't heard from this cabin in years. "Smells better than I figured it would," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Hunger is a good spice," Abigail replied, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "They're not your kin, ma'am." You have no obligation to stay. A promise was made, Mr. Walker. Richard promised me a home. He promised them a mother. It seems we are all that's left of each other's bargain. He moved closer, his presence commanding the small space of the porch. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the scent of leather, horse, and the wild, clean scent of the desert night. "This land is cursed," he said, his voice low and intense. "It took my sister-in-law. It took my brother. It'll take you too if you let it." Finally, she turned to face him. In the fading light, her eyes shone with a fire he hadn't seen before. "Perhaps I am not so easily taken." A jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. It was more than defiance. It was a recognition. He saw in her a strength that mirrored the unforgiving land he called home. And she saw in him a wildness that called to a dormant part of her own spirit. This wasn't just about duty or a promise. It was about survival, and in that shared, unspoken understanding, a dangerous, thrilling connection was forged. "I'll be at my brother's line shack, east of the ridge," he said, his voice rougher than before. "If you need anything." "I need you to understand, Mr. Walker," she said, her chin lifted. "This is my home now, and these are my children. I will not be scared away." He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod. He turned and swung onto his horse, disappearing into the deepening twilight. Abigail stood on the porch, her heart pounding a wild, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. She had not just inherited a house of orphans. She had stepped into a battle for their very souls, and she had just declared war on the man who thought he could win it by default. The first stitch of mending their hearts had been sewn with supper. The first spark of a wildfire had been struck on the porch. Part 3. Smoke on the ridge. The day settled into a fragile rhythm. Abigail rose before dawn, the chill of the cabin a constant reminder of their meager resources. She taught Martha how to make biscuits that rose, Jedediah how to patch a roof without falling through, and the little ones their letters, scratching symbols in the dirt with a stick. She was mending more than clothes. She was stitching together the tattered fabric of a family, but a thread of unease ran beneath the surface. It started with a wisp of smoke from the eastern ridge, a place Silas had told her was uninhabited. It was a thin, gray finger pointing at the sky, visible only at dawn and dusk. It was too deliberate for a random campfire. It was a watchfire. "Riders don't pass this way often," Jedediah confirmed. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the smoke, his hand instinctively resting on the axe handle. "Not unless they're looking for something." Abigail felt a cold dread. Or someone. That night, she bolted the door with the heavy wooden bar, a flimsy defense against a determined man. The cabin felt smaller, the darkness outside more menacing. She found the children huddled together, their earlier laughter replaced by a watchful silence. Silas appeared 2 days later, materializing from the landscape as if summoned by her fear. He carried a freshly killed buck over his shoulders, a silent offering. He dropped it near the porch without ceremony. "You've got watchers," he stated, his eyes already on the ridge. "I know," Abigail said. "Who are they?" "Could be anyone. Land grabbers, vultures who follow the scent of death, hoping to pick a carcass clean." Richard had debts. His gaze swept over her, taking in the faint smudges of flour on her cheek and the determined set of her jaw. A strange, protective anger rose in him. This woman, with her Eastern sensibilities and iron will, was walking into a storm she couldn't comprehend. "If it's trouble," he said, his voice a low growl, "you should take the children and head for town. I'll deal with it." "And leave our home?" The question was sharp, accusatory. "This is all we have. It's all they have. I will not run." "This ain't a parlor game, Abigail." He bit back, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was intimate, jarring. "These are men who'd kill you for the boots on your feet, let alone 100 acres of land with water rights. You think that stew pot and a few lessons will stop a bullet?" "And what is your solution, Silas?" she retorted, stepping closer, her own anger flaring to meet his. "To fight them all yourself? You're one man. I'm the only man this family has left." The words hung in the air, a raw and painful truth. But in his eyes, she saw more than just duty. She saw a fierce, possessive fire. He wasn't just protecting his brother's legacy, he was protecting her. The realization sent a tremor through her, a dizzying mix of fear and a wild, exhilarating thrill. "You are wrong," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They have Jedediah, they have Martha, and they have me. We are not as helpless as you think." He stared at her, the muscle in his jaw working. He wanted to shake her, to make her see the danger. He wanted to pull her behind him and shield her with his own body. This infuriating, stubborn, magnificent woman was getting under his skin, taking root in a part of him he thought had died long ago. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, Abigail couldn't rest. She sat by the dying fire, Richard's ledger in her lap. She'd found it tucked away, his last words a testament of hope. "Clara Mayfield arrives June 3rd, he'd written, getting her name wrong in his fevered state. She's to be treated kindly. She has nothing, but we'll give her everything we've got." A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. A floorboard creaked behind her. Silas stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the moonlit night. He hadn't left. He was a dreamer, Silas said softly, nodding at the ledger. "Always saw the best in people. Usually got him cheated or killed." "He saw the best in me," Abigail whispered. "He trusted me. He trapped you." "No," she said, looking up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "He freed me." He walked over and knelt before her, taking the ledger from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, a touch that was like lightning on dry tinder. He looked from the book to her face, his expression stripped of its usual hardness. "I won't let them take this from you, Abigail," he vowed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I swear it on my brother's grave." In that moment, the threat outside paled in comparison to the storm raging inside the small cabin. It wasn't just a promise to protect a piece of land. It was a man's pledge, raw and elemental. It was a claim. And as he knelt before her, the firelight dancing in his stormy eyes, Abigail knew that the smoke on the ridge was not the only fire she had to fear. The one burning between them was far more dangerous and infinitely more powerful. Part 4. The Brothers' Ledger. The watchers on the ridge disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, but the tension they left behind lingered like a bad taste. The uneasy peace was shattered a week later by the arrival of two men. They weren't shadowy figures in the distance. They rode bold as brass up to the cabin, their horses kicking up dust, their faces smug with a greasy kind of authority. One was a portly man with a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest, the other a Weasley man in a dusty suit. "We're here on behalf of the county," the man with the star announced, not bothering to dismount. "We have a court order regarding the Walker property and the guardianship of these orphans." Abigail stepped onto the porch, Jedediah and Martha flanking her like small, fierce sentinels. "There are no orphans here," Abigail said, her voice steady. "Only children in my care." The man in the suit chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Your care? Ma'am, you're a mail-order bride with no marriage certificate. Legally, you're a squatter. The Walker property is forfeit to pay off outstanding debts, and the children are now wards of the state." He held up a rolled-up document with a wax seal. "We're here to escort them to the orphanage in Prescott." "No," Martha cried, grabbing Abigail's skirt. Jedediah raised the axe he'd been using to chop wood, his knuckles white. "You'll do no such thing," came a low voice. Silas emerged from the barn, a rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. He moved with a lethal grace that made the two men on horseback shift uneasily. "Silas Walker," the man with the star grunted. "We heard you were sniffing around. This doesn't concern you. This is the law." "The law's a long ride from here," Silas said, his eyes cold as ice. "And you're on my family's land." He took a slow step forward. "My brother left a will." The suited man sneered. "A deathbed letter? That won't hold up in any court." "It's not just a letter," Silas said. He pulled a worn, cloth-bound ledger from his saddlebag, a twin to the one Abigail kept by the fire. Richard and I, we didn't part on good terms, but we had a pact. Everything we owned, we logged. An agreement signed and witnessed years ago. If one of us died, his holdings went to the other, to be held in trust for his kin. He opened the ledger. He wrote me every month. I never wrote back, but I kept them. His voice was raw with a grief he had refused to acknowledge until now. His last letter, it was an amendment to our pact. He walked over to Abigail, his eyes never leaving hers, and handed her the ledger. His touch was firm, grounding. "Read it," he commanded softly. With trembling hands, Abigail found the last entry. Richard's script was weak, sprawling across the page, but the intent was clear. "Silas," it read, "if you read this, I am gone. I have sent for a woman, Abigail Cole. I have left her the house and the children, not out of charity, but because I know her heart. This is my final entry into our ledger, my last will. Let her have it all. Protect them for me. Forgive me." A profound silence enveloped the porch. The two men looked from the rifle in Silas' hand to the iron resolve in Abigail's face. They were outmaneuvered, not by law, but by a bond stronger than paper, a dead man's love and a living man's honor. "This changes nothing," the man with the star blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "It changes everything," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You have two choices. You can ride away now, or you can be buried here. I've already dug one grave on this property. A second and third won't be much trouble." The men exchanged a look, swallowed their greed, and turned their horses around, muttering threats about judges and federal marshals. They rode off in a cloud of their own dust and impotence. Abigail looked at Silas, her heart overflowing with a maelstrom of emotions, gratitude, relief, and a fierce, blazing passion that stunned her with its intensity. He hadn't just saved the children. He had honored her. He had seen her, not as a helpless woman, but as the rightful heir to his brother's legacy. She stepped towards him, the ledger clutched to her chest. "He trusted you," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He trusted you," Silas corrected, his gaze softening as he looked at her. He reached out, his callous thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, a brand against her skin. The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with the wild, dangerous promise of what they could be. "Abigail," he murmured, his voice thick. But he didn't finish. He didn't have to. In the silent, charged air of the porch, with the children watching, a new will was being written. Not in a ledger, but in the fierce, undeniable connection that bound two solitary souls together in the heart of the unforgiving West. They were no longer just guardians of a dead man's dream. They were the architects of a new one. Part 5. The Fever. The victory was short-lived. The frontier had more weapons than men with guns. It started with Jonah, the second youngest. A cough. A fever that burned so hot Abigail could feel it from a foot away. Within 2 days, it had swept through the cabin like a wildfire. A shadow that clung to the rafters and settled in the lungs of the children. 4 of them, then 5, burning with a relentless heat. Abigail fought it with every ounce of her being. She boiled pine needle tea, a bitter concoction she forced down their throats. She kept cool cloths on their foreheads, turning and wringing them until her hands were raw. She didn't sleep, her world shrinking to the space between the cots, her ears tuned to the sound of each ragged breath. The cabin became a crucible, smelling of sickness and herbal remedies and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. The worst was Martha. She had been the strong one, Abigail's little lieutenant. When she succumbed, her quiet strength dissolving into delirious whimpers, a part of Abigail's own hope began to fray. Silas found her on the 3rd night, a ghost herself, gaunt and hollow-eyed, rocking the baby who had mercifully been spared so far. He took one look at the scene, the flushed faces, the labored breathing, the despair in Abigail's eyes, and his own blood ran cold. He didn't offer words of comfort. They were useless here. He offered action. "You need to sleep," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll take the watch." Abigail shook her head. "I can't." "You will," he said, gently, but firmly prying the baby from her arms. "You'll be no good to them dead on your feet." She was too exhausted to fight. She stumbled to the corner and collapsed onto a pile of blankets, falling into a dreamless void. When she awoke hours later, the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the grimy window. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. A paralyzing fear seized her. But then she saw him. Silas was sitting by Martha's cot, his large, rough hand resting on her forehead. He was murmuring to her, his voice a low, soothing rumble, telling her a story about a coyote who outsmarted a hawk. He had a wet cloth in his other hand, and he bathed her face with an astonishing gentleness. He had been there all night, fighting the fever alongside her. He looked up and saw her watching, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes struck her to the core. This hard, solitary man who held the world at arm's length was terrified. He was terrified of losing them, of losing her. "Her fever's the same," he said, his voice hoarse. Abigail went to him, kneeling by his side. "We're not losing her, Silas." She placed her hand over his on Martha's forehead. His skin was hot, but hers was cool. The contrast was a small anchor in the terrifying storm of the fever. They were a team, a unit, their strengths and weaknesses balancing each other. For 2 more days, they fought together. He chopped wood, hauled water, and held down the delirious children while Abigail forced broth and medicine between their lips. They moved in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, a partnership forged in the desperate heat of the sick room. The passion that had sparked between them on the porch was transformed, tempered in the crucible of care and fear. It was no longer a dangerous, thrilling attraction. It was a deep, powerful bond. A love that was as fierce and protective as it was wild. On the 4th night, the crisis came. Martha's breathing grew shallow, a faint, fluttering sound. Jedediah, the last to fall ill, cried out in his sleep. Abigail knelt by the fire, her body screaming with exhaustion, her spirit stripped bare. She prayed, not to a distant God she wasn't sure she believed in, but to the vast, silent land itself. "Don't take them," she begged in a whisper. "Take me, take anything, but not them." Silas came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. His touch was not one of pity, but of shared strength. "They're fighters, Abigail, like their mother, like you." And then, a miracle. A tiny whimper from Martha's cot. "Water," she rasped, her eyes fluttering open. They were clear. The fire was gone. One by one, through the night, the fevers broke. Jonah asked for a biscuit. The twins fell into a deep, healing sleep. As the sun rose, casting a clean, golden light into the cabin, a profound, exhausted peace settled over them. Abigail leaned against Silas, her strength finally giving out. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. She wasn't just a mail-order bride, and he wasn't just the estranged brother. They were 2 people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side, forged into something new. She tilted her head back and looked at him, and in his stormy eyes she saw her own reflection. She saw home. She saw a love that was as rugged and enduring as the land itself. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never be alone again. Part 6. Home, Heart, and Horizon. The fever passed, leaving the children weak but alive, and leaving the homestead irrevocably changed. The cabin was no longer just Abigail's place of duty or Silas's inherited burden. It was their sanctuary, consecrated by a shared fight for survival. Silas didn't return to his lined shack. He moved his bedroll to the barn, a silent declaration that he was staying. His presence was a solid, comforting wall around them. The news of their stand against the county men and their triumph over the fever traveled on the wind. The few scattered neighbors who had previously kept their distance began to appear at their gate. A widow brought a sack of flour. A grizzled farmer offered to help Silas rebuild the corral in exchange for a share of the venison. They came not with pity, but with a quiet respect. They saw what was being built here. Not just a patched-up homestead, but a family, forged in defiance of every hardship the territory could throw at them. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Abigail was teaching the younger children to read on the porch, Silas began work on a new project. With Jedediah at his side, he started laying the foundation for a new room off the side of the cabin. "What is this?" Abigail asked, a smile playing on her lips. "A proper schoolroom," Silas said, not looking up from his work, a faint blush on his weathered cheeks. "And a room for you. A woman needs her own space." It was the most romantic thing he had ever said. It was a promise of a future, a recognition of her as the permanent, unshakable heart of their home. Later that evening, as a sliver of moon rose in the indigo sky, he found her by the creek, her shoes off, her feet dipped in the cool water. He sat beside her, skipping a stone across the water's surface. "I never knew what my brothers saw in this place," he said quietly. "To me, it was just dirt and rock and bad memories. But seeing you here, seeing the life you've breathed back into them." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It wasn't just me, Silas," she said, turning to him. "We did it together. Abigail," he said, his voice low and urgent. He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. They were chapped and calloused, but to him, they were beautiful. "I am not a man of pretty words. I don't have much to offer. Just my name, my strength, and a heart that I thought was as dead as my brother's." His stormy eyes searched hers. "I love you, Abigail Cole, with a fierceness that scares the hell out of me. I want to build a life with you, right here." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She had come here seeking shelter and had found a love as vast and wild as the sky above them. "My answer is yes, Silas Walker," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My answer has been yes for a very long time." He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was both a desperate homecoming and a fierce promise. It was a kiss of dust and stars, of hardship and hope, of two lonely souls finding their anchor in one another. It wasn't the gentle, polite love of the world she'd left behind. It was a wild, untamed frontier love, passionate, enduring, and strong enough to build a dynasty upon. They were married by a traveling preacher a month later, under the shade of the cottonwood tree where Richard was buried. The children stood beside them, no longer orphans, but a proud wedding party. Jedediah stood as Silas's best man, his chest puffed out. Martha, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, was Abigail's maid of honor. That night, Abigail wrote one last entry in Richard's ledger, her own neat script filling the page beneath his. "If you find this house," she wrote, "know that it was built not on a promise of ease, but on the courage to love against all odds. It was bought with grief, cemented with loyalty, and made whole by a wild, stubborn hope. So if you are lost, come in. We have been waiting for you." She closed the book and placed it on the mantel of the new room Silas had built for her. It wasn't an ending. It was the true beginning. Years unfolded like the seasons. The small cabin grew, room by room, echoing with the laughter of children. The original 7, and then 3 more, with Silas's stormy eyes and Abigail's iron will. The Walker homestead became a beacon in Redemption Gulch, a testament to the fact that family is not always the one you were born into, but the one you are brave enough to build. The greatest stories of the Wild West aren't always about gunfights and gold rushes. Sometimes they are about the quiet, fierce battles of the human heart. They teach us that a home is not built with wood and nails, but with courage and choice, and that the most profound love often takes root in the hardest soil, proving that even in the dust of our deepest sorrows, something beautiful and wild can and will grow. Thank you for joining us at Wild West Stories. If this tale of resilience and untamed love resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who loves a story where the heart is the most untamed frontier of all.